Dr. Jeffries, welcome to One Question With.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Sam. Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad to be in conversation with you again. I've had a few opportunities throughout my career, and every single time we have the chance to chat, it always transforms how I think about education and history. And, no pressure, but I'm really expecting that of you today.
I'll see what I can do.
Well, this is the third episode in our series on the build up to the American Revolution. And today's episode will focus entirely on the Declaration of Independence. And so, our central question for today is, what did the Declaration of Independence mean in 1776, and what does it mean today? Dr. Jeffries, I know that's a huge question, but what are the first few things that come to your mind when you hear it?
Well, first, I think we have to situate it in the political context of the moment. The Declaration is just that, in the truest sense of the term. It's a declaration of independence from the King of England and from Great Britain. It is a statement saying that we are severing ties, and this is actually part of a sort of long English tradition of sort of deposing kings, right? This isn't a petition of independence. They're not asking, although they had gone through this process and built up over the last decade and a half or so of petitioning both the king and parliament with regard to grievances. And there you're saying, hey, these are the issues that we have. Can we resolve them? So they've graduated from that, and now they've issued this declaration. And in a declaration coming out of the English context, English political context, you're the plaintiff. You're making the case. And then we'll see that, right? The making the case for independence, and included in that for separation, and included in that we'll find sort of a list of grievances. So, politically, this is just really a statement of why the leaders of the 13 colonies decide that they have to have their independence from the English crown. But then, of course, the way it is written, particularly the preamble, gives it sort of a timeless feel, but it is a very practical document. So what comes to mind immediately is the practicality of it, situated in the politics of independence and revolution. We also have to keep in mind that we have a year of fighting already, right? I mean, so it's not like, we hit July 1776, and that's the first time, we're going to see, colonists and the British take up arms against each other. We have Lexington, we have Concord, so we have a year of fighting. The British crown has deployed troops. They've signed treaties with mercenaries. So the declaration is sort of the after effect, right? I mean, this is the Second Continental Congress. So this isn't coming early. This isn't premature. This isn't preemptive. This is following sort of a long kind of escalation that accelerates as we get closer to 1776.
Is it more accurate to think of the Declaration as a statement of ideals or a strategic political document that was meant to sort of justify the revolution that the colonists were hoping to wage?
Both. The answer to any good question is yeah, both. Both. And it's three parts when you think about the Declaration of Independence, right? I mean, you have the introduction, then you have the preamble, then you have the list of grievances, and then and actually a fourth part, you could say sort of the conclusion. And we focus on the preamble because of its sort of universal language, and we can talk about that in a little bit. The grievances make it sort of that practical political document, and we should look at it as such because on the one hand, so this is the and part, right? On the one hand, we should look at it as and take seriously the list of grievances because they're making the case, right? Again, this is a declaration, not a petition. This is going to sort of court and the plaintiff making the argument, saying we have a right to have our independence, and these are the reasons why. And so the list of grievances are all against the king, but you can't separate that out from the universal language that we find in the preamble, and we could talk about that in a second. But the introduction, right, is really important as well because, and that often gets looked over because we jump to the preamble, right? I mean, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary, right, for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them to with another. And then goes on to talk about the laws of nature, entitle them, to seek the court of independence. Like that's telling us what this is. It's like, yo, we have a right. And that's really quick making this sort of this natural enlightenment, sort of natural law sort of argument that, hey, any group of people who are aggrieved, right? I mean, this is the consent of the government. Government derived from the consent of the governed. If the government no longer is responsive or becomes tyrannical towards the people who have given its consent, then the people have the right to withdraw that consent. So they're making a big political argument, right, in sort of universal terms, which is really important. So we could set aside the grievances are time specific, right? The grievances, the list of grievances about the king are the dumb stuff that he's doing, right, from their perspective, right? And that, of course, can change over time. But the introduction is laying out like, hey, this is what government is. This is very Enlightenment thinking, drawn on Locke and the others. The government derives its power from the consent of the governed. And they're saying that people have this right to enter into government and then to dissolve those bonds when that government isn't working in their best interest anymore, and especially when they're not doing so, or they're doing so in a sort of a tyrannical way, which then gets us into the preamble as well, right? Because now they're talking about the consent of the governed and such.
I think that's a really important way to clarify the parts of the declaration. And I think that's really important for students too, to really be able to break down the organization of this document. So I think even if teachers are wondering how to scaffold the declaration for some of their learners, I think really just breaking down those sections can even be super helpful in advance of reading and being able to actually digest the declaration itself. But I also think this is important because when I was speaking with Dr. Alan Taylor, he sort of mentioned, the Enlightenment was not something that really drove the leaders of the 13 colonies to revolution. But what I'm hearing you say here, which I think makes complete sense, is that the Enlightenment, these ideals from Locke and Montesquieu and Rousseau, that these philosophies and ideas about natural law and natural rights, those are the arguments that justify the revolution and essentially make it so that these leaders can unify and unanimously put forward the declaration.
And I would agree. I mean, they're not, Thomas Jefferson and these others aren't, they aren't waking up one day, as you said, reading Montesquieu and Locke, like, oh, hey, let's create a revolution, right? No, they found themselves in this situation, right? Rightly or wrongly. They have these practical grievances. They've decided it's no longer in their best interest as colonies to be under the political control of Great Britain. So they're gone. They're like, we're out. But now they have to rationalize it, right? They have to provide an explanation, a rationalization, a justification to two audiences in particular: the audience of American colonists, right? Because you can have all these great ideas and grievances, but if you can't articulate a reason why people need to risk their lives, I mean, this is treason, right? I mean, this is the consequence for this. If this doesn't work, is death. Hang separate, or hang all together, supposedly Ben Franklin said. So they understand the stakes. So they have to generate support. And the two audiences: one, you got to convince sort of white American male property landowners who are going to be in this. And you also have to convince the sort of European foreign nations, and particularly the French, right, that the cause of this is legitimate and real. And so they do have to frame it. So, and they're going all in. So it's not just like, hey, they're unfairly taxing us without adequate representation and we feel oppressed. They're also saying this is a bigger issue here, right? And the bigger issue is that of sort of a king who's gone tyrannical, and we have a right, we have our universal right, a natural right to break away from that. And so it's looking back and drawing on Enlightenment thinking to provide sort of a universalist argument, justification for breaking away because of the grievances that they will list, the specific context, specific grievances that they'll list following the preamble.
And I do want to dive into the preamble because let's be honest, it's probably the most fun part of the declaration. But there are a few things I want to define before we get into the philosophy behind the preamble. And so the phrase, all men are created equal. It's one of the most quoted lines in American history. It's something that I think many Americans can connect with as maybe part of the country's founding ideals. But in practical terms, in 1776, who was included in that all and who was not included?
Well, in a practical sense, context specific, 1776, when Jefferson et al. Are together convening Second Continental Congress, writing that all men are created equal, they're talking specifically about white men with property and power, period. And this isn't a phrase that is, or an idea that's sort of unique to Jefferson. I mean, he doesn't come up with this. We see other folk who are writing about this, and others will pick up on this language. And so, in a very sort of, again, practical, we always have to sort of separate out and distinguish between what's the practical here, like what are they talking about on the ground versus sort of what is universal, right? And so, practically speaking, they're talking about white men with property and power, and they do not need to distinguish, right? I mean, it's so accepted, the idea of both sort of racial inequality, gender inequality, that they don't feel the need to say, by all men, we mean, right? We mean white men with property and power. No, everybody understood that, right? That is who they meant in this sort of charging document. But there's also sort of understanding the language of the time and this idea of sort of universal equality. And so there is a tension, right, between the practical, like we're not talking about empowering the people that we are holding in bondage, right? Because on the one hand, in order to do that, in order to keep several 100,000 African people in chains, and treat them as property, that is a declaration of itself of the inequality of human beings, right? So they're doing that, right? And at the same time, they're talking about all men are created equal. So that's not actually, there's no tension there. Like the tension is between the grievances and this idea, right? The practical grievances that we have, and this notion that all men are created equal. Therefore, everybody has these certain rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And again, very vague, sort of universal. These are things that all people are born with, that no government can take away. And so when government is taking those away, depriving people of that, hence the grievances, therefore we have this tension. Those two are now in tension. But the idea of sort of universal equality, right, is limited, right? And how do we know this? Because they're buying and selling people, right? So that's not even debatable. Now, we also understand that there is a tension between looking at human beings as equal and as all being humans and being less than human, right? I mean, this is the power of white supremacy. And so somebody like Jefferson, who bemoans the fact that slavery is morally wrong, right? I mean, he's like, this is terrible. We shouldn't be doing this. And yet he's doing what he's doing, right? And all of these things. And so somebody like Jefferson understands you can't have children with a black woman, Sally Hemings, and not recognize inherently the humanity, the equality of that person as a human being, right? Because you have children with them, right? They are your children, literally. And he recognizes them as such. And yet he's still willing to buy and sell others, right? And so they understand at a fundamental level in human equality, and yet they refuse to extend that in the moment because their livelihoods as well as their lives are dependent upon this thing called the institution of slavery. And there was no consideration, to remember the ladies, as Abigail Adams will implore John Adams, who's also one of the drafters of this, when you get there, remember the ladies. And they're like, yeah, no, right? And there's nobody there saying, remember the brothers and sisters, or remember the indigenous folk, right? And so they choose not to. That said, once they put it on paper, you do have other people, right, who are looking at this, who are anti-slavery, who actually believe in that all men and women, regardless of the color of their skin or gender, are equal, who are looking at this in the moment, in real time, and saying, hey, yeah, they are equal. So therefore, by your own logic, although you didn't mean this, let's abolish the institution of slavery. This is why we see in the original, sort of some of the original state constitutions, like in Massachusetts, they're adopting that language, right? Of all men are created equal. Therefore, we have to abolish slavery. Slavery had been in Massachusetts since Massachusetts had been founded. That's 150 years. And now they're using this language to justify or to rationalize the abolition of slavery. So, well, the Constitution, but especially the Declaration of Independence. So this living document. is that once it's on parchment, then people are able to use the language to advocate a more expansive definition of what equality and what freedom actually are. That people have strategically used that language of equality to put forward an argument for equality, for anti-slavery, for civil rights, right? Which is just strategic and makes sense. Abraham Lincoln will do it in the Gettysburg Address. Martin Luther King will do it, not only in 1963, but in a letter from Birmingham jail, right? David Walker and David Walker's appeal, 1827, right? He uses this language. He's like, look what y'all said. You're right. But that just because people are using the words of the Declaration of Independence against those who are anti-equality doesn't mean that we should look back and say, aha, but in truth, they were really hoping for equality all along. No, they weren't. They meant what they said in the limited way in which they said it.
You mentioned Massachusetts and the abolitionist movement there, led by an enslaved woman, Elizabeth Freeman. She was able to use the language of the Declaration to argue for abolition. And it sets a precedent for the abolition of other states. And so you mentioned a few other groups and people who have sort of leveraged the language of the Declaration. I wondered if you would go into maybe any specific example that you feel is pretty particularly powerful of that.
You mentioned Elizabeth Freeman, Mum Bet, right, who will petition the Massachusetts legislature for her freedom. So there's a number of these freedom suits that will often draw on, and she's one of the earliest and most famous, that often draw on the language to make this argument. We see more radical appeals, David Walker's appeal, 1827, but also in abolitionist newspapers, right, of those who are offering this argument, saying, hey, look at the language, let's live up to this. This is more, they're making it aspirational, right, and saying, let's lean into this. Frederick Douglass, of course, not only in his writings in the North Star and his autobiography, but then, of course, in his 1852 speech, what to the 4th of July is the slave. I mean, there he's making the argument. He's like, hey, y'all really dropped the ball. Y'all got this all wrong. We're not celebrating independence because we're not independent, right? I mean, we broke away from the crown, but, we're still held in bondage. So, what to the slave is the 4th of July is a great piece to use in the classroom. And, there we look no further than 1857 ruling in Dred Scott, in which the Chief Justice Roger Taney writes, that the black man has no rights which the white man is bound to respect. That equality articulated in the Declaration of Independence did not apply to African Americans. So that tension, right, of people saying, no, let's use it strategically for these political purposes to advance equality. And you have others, Roger Taney, who are like, nope, right, that's not what they meant. We're holding on to it. We don't believe in equality. We believe in white supremacy. And then we will see it play out. That's just sort of, during the era of slavery. We get a bigger argument, importantly, during the Gettysburg Address and Abraham Lincoln, right? Because when Lincoln talks about the consent of the governed, right, or in Declaration of Independence talking about the consent of the governed, Lincoln takes it, to the next level by saying that means government of the people, for the people, by the people, right? I mean, that's critically important. And in a way, he's using that sort of universal language, and they're to be included in the consent of the governed. So that's a different usage by the President of the United States at a critical moment that is incorporating and broadening out sort of in the original Declaration of Independence. And then, of course, civil rights advocates from the Reconstruction era through the Civil Rights era are constantly using the language of the Declaration of Independence to make the argument, right? And so in that sense, the Declaration, they're saying that the Declaration of Independence ought to be read as aspirational, right? And which is a compelling argument. So we should not fall into the trap of looking at those arguments that people are making, like Dr. King. We hear this all the time. Well, Dr. King said the Declaration of Independence was great. And Abraham Lincoln said the Declaration of Independence was great, so there's nothing wrong with it. No, they're looking at it as an aspirational document saying we can extract from it what the founders never intended, right, to make this country better. It started us off. This is the foundation, and we're building and strengthening that foundation. They were not ignorant to the exclusions that were inherent in the document to begin with. And so that's an important part of that conversation. It's not enough to say, hey, look at these people in the 19th century and the 20th century and the 21st century who are using the document to advance an argument. They're not looking at that blindly. They understand the context. They're adding new meaning to it, saying, hey, let's make it more than what it originally was.
Yeah, I mean, a promissory note still counts, even if the person who wrote it didn't mean for it to pay for what the person who's cashing it wants, right? And, when I was preparing for our interview, I was reading Our Declaration by Danielle Allen, and she has some really interesting thoughts in that text. It's a really great book, highly recommend it. And she mentions, that one of the things that we get out of the Declaration are kind of two pillars of American democracy: liberty and equality. And she argues that throughout American history, but particularly recently, it has often felt to many Americans like they have to choose between those two ideals. I wondered how that statement sort of lands with you, and if you have any reflections just on maybe where we are now with the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, when I think about equality in the context of the framers and what they were arguing for. And again, this is like as we began a conversation about sort of, well, what's the context there? In this document, this declaration declaring their right to break away, to declare their independence, stating, and these are the reasons why. Like they're declaring equality with the British, right? Like they are the political and powerful elite here, and they are saying we are your equal to the British political and powerful elite. So it's an external sort of focus, not an internal focus. So I think we just have to be careful about how we frame equality, like in that, separating out from the context versus as context change, how do people then say, hey, how can we take this and expand upon it, right? Which is fine, which is important, right? I mean, that's the power of the document that we have been able to over the generations sort of interpret it in new ways, right? Not separated from the context. Like we should always be careful to do that, but say, hey, you know what? There are some universal principles in here, even if those dudes weren't thinking about it. They do stumble upon, they do articulate this in a way that there is some fundamental truths in there. And what can we do with that to make our society better, to improve upon our society? Every society, broadly defined, should have these moments of reflection and say, okay, what are our principles, right? And how can we enforce them? How can we reinforce them? How can we expand them? How can we build upon them? Now, we also have to be real clear that that expansion has taken a long time. I mean, because we're talking about all men are created equal. Okay, that's 1776. You don't have essentially universal franchise until 1965, right? With the passage of the Voting Rights Act. I mean, you're talking about 2 centuries just about, right? I mean, more than 2 centuries before you get sort of full citizenship rights granted to African Americans. And then for the next 60 years, you have people who are fighting to roll that back and have succeeded in many ways. So even when we think about equality and America expanding and growing, like none of that is guaranteed, right? All of it can be rolled back because there's a real tension about those who want to expand and those who view any expansion of equality as a threat to their dominance in the society. And so I think in the classroom, though, you have to first talk about the Declaration of Independence in its political context, which is where we began our conversation, so that students are clear that when Jefferson and the others and the Congress sort of sign off on all men are created equal, what they mean by that, like who was not included, and what was their vision, right? So that historical grounding is really important, and then they can see the shortcomings of the intentions, right? The shortcomings of what was included. And then you begin the conversation of, okay, well, then how did those groups on the margins, how did they leverage that document to make the argument, for liberty, for equality, for civil rights, for human rights? Like that's the conversation in these different moments because they will change, right? Frederick Douglass is using it in a different way than Dr. King will be using it. then President Obama will be using it, or those who are advocating, for preserving voting rights in 2013 or in 2020, 2026 will be using it. And so I think you can have a series of distinct conversations. I think you also can ask students, what does equal mean, right? Like what does it mean? Not just to say that, you know, you know, all people are created equal, right? Or are born equal. Like, what does that mean? Are people born equal in this society? I'd be curious to see what students have to say about that, right?
And I think that's why it's so important to situate historical documents, primary sources with questions so that students can explore them and come to their own conclusions with the context that you mentioned earlier. Because to present a historical document without context is to offer possible misinterpretations, right? Room for misinterpretation. But I really think that allowing students to ask their own questions and you asking questions of them too, it's such a rich opportunity to use the classroom for your own learning too, because I'm curious, like you said, I'm curious to know what are students thinking right now about these terms. And I think that they have a lot to teach us about how to position America to live up to the ideals that were named in these founding documents. And I think that students, just like other groups of people who may have been discounted or put in the margins, as you said, are active political thinkers and they are capable of this thought. And it's important to empower them to engage in those conversations in the classroom.
Yeah, we absolutely need to think about sort of the students in our classrooms as capable political thinkers. And it's also, sort of asking them, what does that look like today, after having a discussion about what has that looked like over time. And then you're actually saying, to your students, I'm going to treat what you say as seriously as I'm treating what the founder said, right? Because what you have to say is just as important.